Welcome. In this video we're going to be talking about depression, what depression is, and some of the biological and psychological factors behind it. Depression is an extremely serious illness. So serious, in fact, that the World Health Organization declared it to be the world's leading cause of ill health and disability. The world's leading cause of ill health and disability. Professor Salposky at Stanford University says that this is the worst disease you can possibly have. And he says that because in many cases when one's depressed, one becomes what we call anhedonic. And when one's anhedonic, one experiences no pleasure or hardly any pleasure at all in life. And Sapolsky points out that even when you're dying of cancer, you can sometimes experience some pleasure. But with this kind of depression where there's anhedonia, there can be no pleasure at all. It's a kind of living hell. So what we're talking about here is a serious clinical depression. We're not talking about kind of, just an unhappy period, or we're not talking about the kind of situation where you have an argument with your partner and, you feel unhappy for a couple of days, or you lose something and you feel miserable for a day or two. That's not what we're talking about here. People who have this kind of clinical depression, who experience what we call a major depressive episode, tend to go down, tend to go deeply down, and then tend to stay down. So we're talking about a clinical depression, a major depressive episode. So what are the symptoms of a major depressive episode? Well, we've come across one of them already, which is the anhedonia, the inability to experience much or any pleasure in life at all. Then there can be a depressed mood. And the mood, we're not talking about just a little bit down, we're talking about really down. And it can go down as almost to an absolutely psychotic state. So, for example, I happened to come across a couple in a hospital, not my clients, and the wife was in a postpartum depression and had gone psychotic, and she thought her child was Satan. In fact, she named her child Satan. So, it can be down to a psychotic degree, and can be terribly painful. In fact, one of the chemicals that's released when we're in physical pain also is released when we're in psychological pain from a depression in many people. The drop in mood can be extremely painful indeed. So to diagnose a major depressive episode, we've either got to have this anhedonia most of the day, nearly every day for 2 weeks, or we've got to have a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day for 2 weeks. And that would be, just describing it in that way would be the mild end of a clinical depression. At the extreme end, the person is bedridden, unable to get out of bed, suicidal, hopeless, and so on. So what are the other symptoms of depression? Well, there are many. One of the symptoms is feeling tired all the time. So people who have a major depressive episode typically feel very tired, or feel tired all the time. And they find they wake up unrefreshed in the morning. So there's very often a sleep disturbance too. They'll wake up early in the morning, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, wake up typically very down at that point, often the low point of the day. And they'll wake up and feel tired, feel like they haven't had a good sleep, feel unrefreshed, and yet can't sleep. That's a biological symptom, that early morning awakening, and so is the tiredness. There can also be what we call psychomotor retardation, which is a slowing of speech and of movement. So people with deep depression might talk very slowly, they might move very slowly, and that's psychomotor retardation. There can be excessive or inappropriate guilt, to a delusional level, even where people feel that they're responsible for destroying other people's lives, or they feel terribly guilty about having lived such terrible lives or done such terrible things. There really can be excessive and inappropriate guilt. Very often people who are in a major depression also find it very difficult to concentrate, to think, and therefore to also remember things. This is also a physical byproduct of major depression. There can be a loss of appetite together with weight loss, and there can be an increase in appetite. Either of those can occur without the attempt to lose or gain weight, but there can be weight loss or gain through this change in appetite. Very often people feel worthless when they in this kind of major depressive episode, just feel that they're absolutely worthless, that the world would be better off without them. And so the self-esteem just absolutely plunges. One of the most dangerous things about a major depressive episode is suicidality. About 600,000 people kill themselves worldwide every year. That's an incredible impact on the world. When people kill themselves, it affects others terribly, sometimes for generations. And it's very, very painful, very often for those who are left. And many of the suicides are precipitated by major depressive episodes. So you might think, well, 600,000 people, not so many people. But if you look at it over a lifetime, 1% of people will commit suicide over a lifetime. And that's an incredible number of people. So please take people's suicidality seriously. People tend to be suicidal when they're feeling hopeless, when they feel they just can't go on, when they need some relief, they just can't bear it anymore. And strangely enough, we often think that when people are completely immobilized that they're at most risk, but that's not the case. It's when people start getting better, when they have the energy to kill themselves, that they're most at risk of killing themselves. So the outlook tends to be very bleak. They tend to be negative about themselves, negative about their life circumstances, negative about the future. And that's what cognitive therapists call the negative triad of depression. It's an awful, awful disease. And it is a disease. Why do I call it a disease? Well, it has a biological component, and a very big biological component. So why do I say that? Well, if you look at the genetics, you'll see that there is a family tendency. A tendency runs in families to a tendency to depression, to this kind of depression. So if your parents had this kind of depression, you're more likely than the general population to get this kind of depression. In the general population, about 15% of people will get this kind of depression during their lifetime. And that might not sound like a lot, but if you think of it, it's estimated that about 264 million people have a major depression at any one time in the world. And if you look at a lifetime prevalence, you're going to find that more than 1 billion people are likely to have this kind of depression during their lifetime. That's an incredible impact on life for us as humans. So you've got a genetic impact. If you look at, for example, identical twins, if you have an identical twin and your identical twin gets depressed, this kind of depression, you have about a 50% chance of getting this kind of depression. So more than three times the risk in the general population. So there's a genetic component. And that genetic component, there's a lot of other proof of the genetic component, some of it very complex. There's one gene, for example, that's been identified to be associated with depression, and there are two possible forms of that gene. let's call the one good and the one bad. If you have the bad form and your friend has the good form, you're about as likely as your friend to get major depression or have a major depressive episode. But if you had major stresses during your childhood and you have the bad variant, you're about 30 times or up to 30 times more likely to get a major depressive episode in your lifetime. So stress is an important component in depression, particularly stresses that happen in childhood. And we're talking about major stresses like sexual abuse, like physical abuse, like alcoholic parents acting out in a violent way, a loss of a close family member. Those sorts of stresses predispose us in adulthood to depression. So, for example, if you take somebody younger than 10, say an 8-year-old, say you were 8 and you lost a parent, if that happened to you, you'd be predisposed to major depressive episode to a greater degree than the general population for the rest of your life. That's what the statistics show. Why is this? Well, if we go into it and we look at what the factors are that really make stress impact us greatly, one of the factors is if stress affects us very greatly if we don't have an outlet for frustration. Another factor is that if we don't have control, the stress affects us much more greatly. If we don't have a sense of being able to predict the stressful events, they affect us much more. And also if we don't have emotional support. So if you imagine a little boy, say, losing a parent at 8 years old, it would have been, he would have felt that it was out of his control. He would have felt that it was unpredictable. He may well not have had the support he needed because either to express his frustration or to get the emotional support, because the other family members would have been deeply affected by the loss too. So what happens in a child that age is that they develop a way of thinking which we call learned helplessness, and they anticipate that in future stressful events they won't be able to have any agency. In other words, they won't have control, there won't be predictability, there won't be the emotional support, they won't be able to express their own frustration, and so that then at a later date triggers a depression. Any kind of passive sense of helplessness makes one more predisposed to depression. So that's another indication that the genes are very important and that the genes interact with stresses. And that stress is a very important predisposing element in depression. So how does stress link up with the biology of depression? With depression, we know that certain neurotransmitters levels drop, serotonin, dopamine, so on. And what is it that mediates between the stress and the neurotransmitters? And what we've discovered is that cortisol is a major mediator. Cortisol is one of the two main hormones that's released when we're feeling stressed, adrenaline being the most commonly known. The other one is cortisol. Cortisol actually mediates the activity of a gene that's responsible for serotonin levels in the brain. And so that's one of the links between stress and the biology of depression. So it's a complicated business, but really what I'm trying to emphasize here is that stresses in childhood predispose us to depression, that depression is a very serious illness indeed, and that it has a big biological component to it. So part of the implication of this is that we can treat depressions biologically. So one of the most effective antidepressants, for example, is exercise. Exercise changes us physiologically. It's very important for those people who are depressed. If they can bear exercising, it's a really good idea to exercise. It's been shown that antidepressants and exercise are about equal in their effectiveness in treating depression. So there's exercise, there's antidepressants. Many of my clients are very negatively predisposed towards antidepressants. Don't like antidepressants, don't like pills, don't want to take pills, and so on. That having been said, I've seen many people helped by antidepressants. I know there's side effects. I know it's sometimes difficult to get off some of the antidepressants, but really if antidepressants are prescribed in a skillful way, they can be enormously helpful for people that are depressed. At least that's my experience with many hundreds of people who are depressed. And then genetic advances too. It's now possible to test genetically to see which antidepressants are going to be most effective for any particular person. There are herbal treatments that can be helpful. St. John's wort, very commonly prescribed in Germany, for example, for depression. And there's a South African plant called Scaletium, which is as effective as St. John's wort in my experience. So very helpful too. But a biological treatment of depression only really helps in 30 to 40% of cases. And the reason for that is, as we've seen, there are psychological elements that need to be dealt with. And there are often situational elements as well. If somebody has no work and their partner's left them and they're really struggling, they're more likely to be depressed than if everything in their circumstances is going well. So, one has to deal with the circumstances, and one has to deal with the psychology, particularly this learned helplessness kind of psychology, this which can often tie into a kind of victim mentality. So that requires skilled help from somebody who's going to be supportive, help the person with depression through what is often a difficult journey to recovery, and helping them to get there quickly and effectively, whilst feeling supported and heard, understood, and so on. I, when I was young, suffered a great deal from major depression, and fortunately don't now, but it's left me with a real empathy for people who have this kind of depression. It's really a living hell. It's one can feel like one's being sucked into a black vortex, that one's being pulled down into a very painful experience of things where there's not only a lack of pleasure, there's actually a painful feeling of torment. It really is not a pleasant thing. And it's not the kind of thing where you can say to people, look, just pull yourself together, just get on with it, what's wrong with you, things in your life are just fine, you're really lucky, you've got all this and you've got all that. That doesn't help with major depression. One needs skilled treatment, with or without drug treatment. One needs a skilled therapist to help with major depression. So I hope that helps. Please take it seriously. Please get help if you have major depression, a major depressive episode. And if you know people who do, please encourage them. Please don't discourage them from taking antidepressants. But if they want to take antidepressants, please make sure that they are getting administered by somebody who has a lot of skill in the area. Take good care.